They say every man has one moment in his life where everything changes. One single moment. Mine happened in the back corner of a rusted-out junkyard in the middle of nowhere, standing over a mound of dirt with a shovel in my hands and my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Because buried under that dirt was a car. Not just any car. A car my uncle had hidden from the world for over 40 years. A car that would answer questions I'd been carrying my entire life. A car that would take me from sleeping under a highway overpass to standing in rooms I never believed a man like me would ever be allowed to enter. My name is Daniel Whitmore. 2 years ago, I was homeless, a veteran with nothing but a duffel bag, a bad shoulder, and a list of regrets longer than the interstate I slept beside. And then a letter found me. A letter about an uncle I barely remembered, a junkyard I'd never seen, and an inheritance that everyone told me was worthless. They were wrong. They were so wrong. Before I take you into this story, and I promise you, every twist in it is one I still have trouble believing myself, do me one small favor. Hit that like button like it owes you money. And if you're new here, tap subscribe so you don't miss what I share next. Because trust me, this story has chapters I'm still living. And here's the part I genuinely love. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you're watching from right now. I read them all, every single one, and it still amazes me that a man who once talked to nobody for weeks at a time now gets to hear from people in every corner of this planet. So go ahead, tell me where you are. Tokyo, Texas, Nairobi, Norway, a small village nobody's ever heard of. I want to know who's sitting with me around this fire tonight. All right, get comfortable, because this is the story of how a buried car changed everything. To understand what that junkyard meant to me, you have to understand where I was when the letter arrived. And to understand that, I have to take you back further. Back before the overpass. Back before the shelters and the food lines, and the nights so cold I'd wrap newspaper inside my jacket just to keep my chest warm. Back to when I was somebody. Or at least, when I thought I was. I grew up in a small town in eastern Ohio, the kind of place where the factory whistle used to set everyone's clocks until the factory closed, and the whistle went silent forever. My father, Thomas Whitmore, worked that factory floor for 19 years. He was a quiet man, not cold, just quiet, like he was always carrying something heavy he didn't want anyone else to have to lift. My mother left when I was 7. I don't remember much about her except the smell of her perfume and the sound of the screen door the morning she walked out of it. After that, it was just me and Dad in a 2-bedroom house with a leaky roof and a garage that he treated like a church. Because here's the thing about my father. The man loved cars. Loved them the way some men love God or football or the bottle. On Saturday mornings, he'd pull whatever half-dead vehicle he was nursing that month into the driveway, and he'd hand me a wrench, and for a few hours the quiet man would talk. He'd talk about engines like they were living things. He'd say, "Danny, an engine doesn't lie to you. You treat it right, it treats you right. People," he'd say, "people are more complicated." And then he'd go quiet again, and I always got the feeling that somewhere in that silence there was a story he was choosing not to tell me. There was one story in particular he never told, the story of his brother, my Uncle Raymond. I knew I had an uncle. I'd seen exactly one photograph of him, tucked in the back of a drawer. 2 young men leaning against the fender of a muscle car sometime in the early 70s, both of them grinning like the world hadn't gotten to them yet. The taller one was my dad. The one with the wild hair and the cigarette behind his ear, that was Ray. When I was maybe 10, I asked my father why we never saw him. My dad looked at that photo for a long, long time. Then he put it back in the drawer, closed it gently, and said, "Some things break, Danny, and it's nobody's fault, and they stay broken." That was it. That was all I ever got. 2 brothers, 1 photograph, and a silence that lasted the rest of my father's life. I enlisted in the Army 3 weeks after my 18th birthday. Part of it was money, because college wasn't happening on factory wages that no longer existed. Part of it was the town itself, which by then felt like a photograph fading in the sun. But if I'm honest with you, and I promised myself I'd be honest in this video, part of it was that I wanted to matter. I wanted to be part of something that had weight to it. My father drove me to the recruiter's office in a Buick he'd rebuilt from the frame-up, and when I got out of the car, he shook my hand like I was a man, for the first time, and said, "You come back, Danny. You hear me? You come back." He didn't say be safe. He didn't say be a hero. He said come back. I think about that a lot. I served 11 years. I'm not going to turn this video into a war story, because that's not what this is, and honestly, some doors I keep closed for my own good. What I'll tell you is this. I did 2 deployments. I was a mechanic, which surprised nobody who knew whose son I was. I kept convoys running in places where a broken-down truck wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. I was good at it. Maybe the best thing I've ever been good at. My hands knew things my head didn't have words for, just like my old man. And for a while, the Army gave me exactly what I'd gone looking for. Purpose, brotherhood, a reason to get up that was bigger than myself. Then came the day everything changed the first time. I won't go into detail. I'll just say there was an explosion, and I was close enough to it that my shoulder has never worked right since. And 2 men I loved like brothers didn't come home, and part of me stayed over there in the sand with them. The Army patched up the shoulder as best they could and eventually, politely, showed me the door with a medical discharge, a folded flag's worth of gratitude, and a handshake. I was 29 years old, and I came home to find out my father was dying. Lung cancer. All those years on the factory floor, all those cigarettes he swore he'd quit. I spent the last 8 months of his life in that little house with the leaky roof, and here's the cruel joke of it. Those 8 months were some of the best we ever had. The quiet man finally talked, not about everything, but about a lot. About my mother, and how he never blamed her for leaving because he knew he wasn't an easy man to love. About the factory. About engines, always about engines. But every time I steered anywhere near his brother, that drawer in his mind slid shut again. One night near the end, when the medication had him drifting somewhere between this world and the next, he grabbed my wrist with more strength than he'd shown in weeks, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Ray was right." "Tell him Ray was right." I said, "Right about what, Dad?" "Right about what?" But he was already gone somewhere else, and 3 days later he was gone for good. Ray was right. 2 words I carried for years like a stone in my pocket, with no idea what they meant. After the funeral, things came apart slowly, and then all at once. That's how it happens, you know. Nobody wakes up homeless. You slide there, inch by inch, and every inch feels survivable, until suddenly you look up and you're at the bottom of a hill you don't remember rolling down. The house went first. Turned out Dad had remortgaged it twice to cover medical bills, and the bank owned more of it than I did. The jobs went next. I tried. God knows I tried. I worked at 3 different garages, and I was good, I was fast. But my shoulder would lock up without warning, and worse than the shoulder was the noise. A dropped exhaust pipe, an air hammer going off behind me, and suddenly I wasn't in Ohio anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere with sand and smoke, and I'd come back to myself standing in the parking lot with no memory of walking out there. My heart slamming, my hands shaking, and my boss looking at me the way you look at a dog that might bite. The VA tried to help. I want to say that clearly, because there are good people there drowning in a system that moves slower than grief. There were wait lists. There were forms. There were phone calls that ended in more phone calls. And somewhere in the middle of all that waiting, I stopped calling back. Depression doesn't announce itself. It just turns the volume of your life down, one notch a day, until everything sounds far away, even your own voice. I lost the apartment 14 months after I buried my father. I remember standing on the sidewalk with a duffel bag and a toolbox, my whole life reduced to what I could carry, and thinking, this is temporary. This is a rough patch. Everybody has rough patches. The rough patch lasted almost 3 years. I'm going to be straight with you about what homelessness is actually like, because I think people deserve the truth. And because some of you watching this might be closer to it than you want to admit. And I want you to hear this from someone who's been there. It's not one dramatic thing. It's 1,000 small humiliations stacked on top of each other. It's learning which fast food places let you sit for an hour if you buy a coffee, and which ones call the police. It's the way people's eyes slide off you, like you're a piece of furniture, like making eye contact with you might be contagious. It's sleeping with your boots on and your bag under your head, not because you're comfortable, but because you've learned what happens if you don't. It's being invisible and completely exposed at the same time, every single hour of every single day. I slept under the Route 9 overpass most nights. There was a little community there, if you can call it that. Marcus, who'd been a roofer until his back gave out. Jenny, who talked to people who weren't there but shared her food with people who were. And an old-timer everyone called Preach, another vet, Vietnam era, who told me something one freezing night that I want to pass on to you. Because it ended up being the truest thing anybody said to me in those years. He said, Danny, the world will forget you out here. That's a fact, and there's no fighting it. But don't you dare forget yourself. Keep one thing, one habit, one routine, one anything that reminds you who you are. Because the day you forget yourself is the day you don't come back. So I kept one thing. Every morning, no matter how cold, no matter how bad the night had been, I opened that toolbox and I cleaned my father's tools. Every wrench, every socket, wiped down and set back in its place. People thought I was crazy, polishing tools I had no car to use them on, no garage to work in. But that toolbox was my flag, you understand? As long as those tools were clean, I was still Thomas Whitmore's son. I was still a mechanic. I was still somebody, even if the only person who knew it was me. 3 years, 3 winters. And then, on a gray morning in late March, a woman from a veterans outreach program named Carol found me at the day shelter and said 6 words that split my life in 2. Daniel, someone's been looking for you. Now, when you've been on the street a while, the phrase someone's been looking for you does not sound like good news. It sounds like a warrant. It sounds like a debt collector with a long memory. I actually took a half step back, and Carol must have seen it in my face, because she put a hand up and said, No, honey, it's nothing like that. It's a lawyer. From Arizona. He's been trying to find you for almost 5 months. It's about your uncle. I said I don't have an uncle. And even as the words left my mouth, I saw it. That photograph in the drawer. 2 young men and a muscle car. The wild hair. The cigarette behind the ear. Some things break, Danny, and they stay broken. Carol handed me a letter. Real paper, heavy, with a law office's name embossed at the top. Hendricks and Associates, Cottonwood Springs, Arizona. And I stood there in the middle of that shelter, with people shuffling past me toward the coffee urn, and I read the first paragraph maybe 6 times before it went in. Dear Mr. Whitmore, we regret to inform you of the passing of your uncle, Raymond Earl Whitmore, on November the 9th of last year. As the sole surviving relative of the deceased, you are named the primary beneficiary of his estate, which includes approximately 11 acres of property and the business situated upon it, operating under the name Ray's Salvage and Auto Parts. We have made numerous attempts to contact you. Please call our office at your earliest convenience. I want to describe to you what happened inside me in that moment, and I've never quite found the words for it, but I'll try. It wasn't joy. It wasn't grief either, exactly. Because how do you grieve a man you met once, if I even met him at all? It was more like a door opening in a house you thought you knew, revealing a whole room that had been there your entire life. My uncle had died in November. It was now the end of March, which meant that for 5 months, while I'd been sleeping under an overpass wrapped in newspaper, somewhere out in the Arizona desert there had been 11 acres of land with my name attached to it. 5 months where the universe had already changed my life, and just hadn't managed to tell me yet. Carol let me use the office phone. My hands were shaking so badly I misdialed twice. A receptionist answered, and when I said my name, there was this pause, and then she said, "Oh my goodness, hold on," and I heard her half shout across the office, "It's him. It's the nephew. He's alive." The lawyer's name was Gerald Hendricks, and he had the voice of a man who'd spent 40 years being calm on behalf of other people. He confirmed everything. My Uncle Raymond had passed away in his sleep, at his kitchen table apparently, with the radio still on. No wife, no children. A will, handwritten but perfectly legal, witnessed and notarized 9 years earlier, leaving everything too, and Gerald read me the exact words. My brother's boy, Daniel, wherever he is. My brother's boy, wherever he is. That phrase just about took my legs out from under me. Because it meant Ray knew about me. It meant that all those silent years, while my father was closing that drawer over and over, his brother was out in the desert thinking about a nephew he'd never known, and writing him into his will anyway. Then Gerald cleared his throat, and his voice changed a little, and he said, "Daniel, I have to be honest with you about what you're inheriting, because I don't want you getting on a bus with the wrong idea. It's a junkyard. It's an old, tired junkyard at the end of a dirt road, and it hasn't turned a real profit in years. There are back taxes owed. Not catastrophic, but not nothing. There's a scrap dealer out here, a fellow named Vance Corrigan, who's already made an offer to buy the whole property as is. $40,000. After taxes and fees, you'd clear maybe 31. He paused, and then he said, "Most people in your situation would take that money, son. I'd understand if you did. I can have papers ready in a week, and you'd never even have to come out here. $31,000. I want you to understand what that number sounds like to a man who has, at that moment, $9 and change in his pocket. It sounds like salvation. It sounds like an apartment with a door that locks, and a bed, and a refrigerator with food in it. It sounds like being a person again. Every practical bone in my body, and the street makes all your bones practical, was screaming, 'Take the money. Danny, take the money before it evaporates like everything else.' I told Gerald I'd think about it and call him back in the morning. That night I didn't sleep. I sat under the overpass with my back against the concrete, with Preach snoring 20 feet away, and I took out the one photograph I'd kept when the house was lost. You already know which one. 2 brothers, One car, the early 70s. I held a lighter up to it, not to burn it, just to see it, and I looked at Ray's grinning face for a long time. And I kept hearing my father's voice, in that hospital bed, gripping my wrist. Ray was right. Tell him Ray was right. I never got to tell him. Ray died without ever hearing whatever it was my father needed him to hear. That message had been sitting in my pocket like an undelivered letter for years. And now both the sender and the receiver were gone, and I was the only person left alive who even knew it existed. And there was something else. Gerald had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that this scrap dealer, this Corrigan, had made his offer within 2 weeks of Ray's death. Before they'd even located me. Before anyone knew if there was an heir at all. Now, maybe that's just business. Vultures circle, that's what vultures do. But I'd spent 11 years in the army and 3 years on the street, and both of those educations teach you the same lesson. When somebody is in a hurry to buy something everyone agrees is worthless, it's usually not worthless. The sun came up over the highway, and I watched it, and somewhere in that cold orange light I made the only reckless decision of my adult life, or maybe the first sane one. I still can't decide. I called Gerald back and I said, "I'm not selling, I'm coming out there." He was quiet a second, and then he said, and I could hear him smiling, "You know, your uncle told me once, if the boy ever shows up, he'll want to see it for himself. He's a Whitmore. They don't take anybody's word for anything. Carol's outreach program bought my bus ticket. I want that on the record, because people love to say pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I did pull. I pulled hard. But somebody else bought my boots a ride to Arizona. And I will spend the rest of my life paying that forward. 41 hours on a Greyhound, Ohio to Cottonwood Springs, with my duffel bag on my lap and my father's toolbox between my feet, because I did not trust it in the luggage bay. I watched the whole country slide past that window. The green went yellow, the yellow went brown, the flat went jagged, and somewhere around New Mexico the land opened up into that enormous desert emptiness that either terrifies you or feels like the first deep breath you've taken in years. For me, it was the breath. Gerald picked me up at the station himself. He was smaller than his voice, maybe 70. With a bolo tie and sun-creased skin, and he shook my hand and looked at me a moment too long. And then he said something I didn't understand until much later. He said, "Good Lord, you stand just like him." We drove 20 minutes out of town, past the last gas station, past the last power line, down a dirt road the color of rust, and then Gerald slowed and pointed through the windshield and said, "There she is, son. There's your inheritance." I don't know exactly what I'd been picturing on that bus. Something out of a movie, maybe. What I saw was this. A sagging chain-link fence running along the road, patched in a dozen places with everything from plywood to an old bed frame. A gate with a hand-painted sign, the paint gone pale pink where it used to be red, that read Ray's Salvage and Auto Parts. And underneath, in smaller letters, "If we don't have it, you don't need it." And behind that fence, stretching back toward a low ridge of red rock, 11 acres of the past. Cars, hundreds of them. Maybe 400, Gerald guessed. Nobody had counted in years. Sedans and pickups and station wagons and vans, in rows that had probably been orderly once, sitting in the sun in every stage of surrender. Some were just shells, sandblasted down to bare metal the color of the desert itself, like the land was slowly digesting them. Cactus grew up through engine bays. A whole family of quail burst out of a school bus as we drove in. Near the front there was a workshop, a big steel building, and beside it a small house, and I mean small. 2 rooms and a porch. with a swamp cooler on the roof and a chair by the door facing west, toward the sunset, worn down in the seat the exact shape of a man. Gerald handed me a ring of keys, heavy as a fistful of gravel, and he said, "Take your time. Call me when you're ready to talk paperwork." And then, God bless him, he left. He just left me there, standing alone in the middle of 11 acres that belonged to me, in the ringing desert silence, holding keys to doors I'd never opened, left to me by a man I'd never known. I want to tell you what I did first, and I'm not embarrassed about it. I sat down in the dirt, right there in the middle of the yard, and I cried. Not pretty crying, the kind that comes up from somewhere below your ribs and doesn't ask permission. 3 years, man, 3 years of nobody's eyes, of concrete, of being a problem for people to step around. And now the deed to a piece of the earth had my name on it. It didn't matter in that moment that it was a graveyard of cars in the middle of nowhere. It was mine. There was a door, and it locked, and I had the key. The house was like stepping inside another man's mind. Ray had left it. Well, he'd left it like a man who didn't know he was leaving. A coffee cup in the sink, a crossword 3/4 done, folded on the table, with the pen still on it. The radio Gerald mentioned, an old tube-amplified thing that probably predated me. And on the walls, everywhere, pictures of cars. Cut from magazines, printed from who knows where, some actual photographs. And in the middle of the biggest wall, in a real frame, the only framed thing in the house, was a photograph I recognized instantly because I had its twin in my duffel bag. 2 young men, 1 muscle car, the early 70s. My father and my uncle, grinning at a camera 50 years ago, hanging in a house neither of them was alive to stand in. I put my copy on the table below it. First thing I unpacked, the brothers, back in the same room after half a century. That first night I slept in the chair on the porch, because sleeping in Ray's bed felt like wearing a dead man's boots before you've earned them. And I watched more stars come out than I'd seen in my entire life combined. And somewhere out in the yard a coyote sang. And for the first time in 3 years, I slept for 6 unbroken hours, outdoors, unafraid. Now, I told you this is a calm story, and it is, so I'm not going to pretend the next part was a montage. It was work. Plain and slow. I had $31 when I arrived, and the estate had a small bank account, about $1,900, that Gerald unlocked for me. And there were back taxes hanging over everything like a cloud. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I opened my father's toolbox, and I went to work. I cleaned out the workshop first, and let me tell you, that workshop told me who my uncle was better than any letter could have. The man was a genius with his hands. There were half-finished projects everywhere, an engine rebuilt so beautifully it belonged in a museum, tools organized in a system that took me a week to decode and that I now realize was smarter than mine. And he kept records. Oh, did he keep records? Every car in that yard had an index card, handwritten, in long wooden drawers like a library catalog. Year, make, model, what it came in with, what had been pulled off it and sold. 40 years of the automotive history of one corner of Arizona, in one man's careful, slanted handwriting. Word got around, the way it does in small towns, that Ray's nephew had shown up and the yard was open again. People started coming down that dirt road, first out of curiosity, then with actual needs. A rancher needing an alternator for a '92 Ford. A teenager restoring a Nova with his grandfather, hunting trim pieces. A woman who just wanted a side mirror so her old Corolla would pass inspection. And I'd walk out into the rows with Ray's index cards, and I'd find it and I'd pull the part and they'd hand me actual money, and I cannot explain to you what those first $20 bills felt like in my hand. Money I'd earned with my father's tools on my uncle's land, standing up straight, looking people in the eye. Every transaction stitched a little piece of me back together. The town itself surprised me. I braced for suspicion, the drifter nephew showing up to claim land, but Cottonwood Springs mostly just seemed relieved. Turned out Ray was loved out there, in that gruff way small towns love their hermits. The waitress at the diner, Dolores, teared up when I introduced myself and refused to let me pay for breakfast that day or, as it turned out, any day since. The parts store owner, Manny, had been Ray's chess opponent every Thursday for 20 years, and now he is mine. Piece by piece, from a dozen people's stories, my uncle assembled himself in front of me. Stubborn, brilliant, kind and secret, the type to fix a widow's brakes for free and swear her to silence. And private. Deeply, deliberately private. Especially, more than one person told me about the back of the yard. That was the first time I heard it. The back of the yard. Manny said it over a chessboard, casual as anything. He said, "You know, in 40 years, Ray never let a single soul walk the back 2 acres with him. Customers, friends, nobody. He fenced it off inside the fence. Said it was just crushed stock back there. Nothing worth picking." And then Manny moved his bishop, took my knight, and said the sentence that started everything. But I'll tell you what, Danny, for a patch of nothing, he sure did check on it every single night of his life. I'd like to tell you I marched straight out to the back 2 acres that same evening. I didn't. And I've thought a lot about why. Part of it was work. The yard was keeping me busy dawn to dark, and the shoulder only gives me so many hours a day. But the honest answer is that something in me wasn't ready. You have to understand, that yard had already given me more than anyone had given me in a decade. A roof. A trade. A town. I think some part of me was afraid to ask it for one more thing, in case asking broke the spell. So for a few weeks, the back of the yard just sat out there at the edge of my days, behind its inner fence, the way Ray's name had sat in that drawer all through my childhood. A door I walked past without opening. But it worked on me. Every evening, from the porch, I'd catch myself looking out at that far corner where the rows dissolved into brush and shadow against the red ridge. And I noticed things. The inner fence back there wasn't junkyard patchwork like the rest. It was good chain link, newer, properly stretched, with a gate that had not one padlock but 2. In a yard held together with baling wire and prayers, somebody had spent real money on that corner. And there was a path. That's what got me. A footpath, worn into the hard ground, leading from the house, around the workshop, straight back to that gate. You know how long it takes feet to wear a visible path into desert hardpan? Years, decades. Manny wasn't exaggerating. Ray really had walked out there every night of his life. Then came the day with Corrigan, and that changed the temperature of everything. I'd been on the property about 2 months when a black pickup, brand new, too clean for that road, came down the drive trailing a plume of dust. Out steps a big man in a pressed shirt, sunglasses, boots that had never touched a scrap pile, and he introduces himself with a handshake like a hydraulic press. Vance Corrigan. Corrigan Metals and Recovery. The man who'd offered 40 grand for the place before my uncle was cold. He was friendly. That's the thing I want you to picture. He was extremely friendly, in that way that feels like being circled. Walked the front rows with me, complimented the operation, told a couple of stories about Ray that didn't quite sound like the Ray everyone else described. And then, real casual, hands in his pockets, squinting out at the property like he was appraising the sunset itself, he said, Listen, Daniel, I'll be straight. My offer stands, and I'll do better. 60,000, cash, as is. You walk away tomorrow with more money than this place will net you in 10 years, and I take all this rust off your hands. Now, $60,000. 2 months earlier, I'd been sleeping under an overpass. But 2 months of small-town chess games educate a man. I'd learned by then that scrap prices were soft that year. I'd learned that Corrigan had bought and crushed 3 other old yards in the county, and that he'd never once paid over market for any of them. 60 grand for 11 acres of half-picked stock at the end of a dirt road wasn't an offer. It was a tell. So I smiled, and I thanked him, and I said I wasn't selling, and I watched his friendliness flicker, just for a half second, like a light in a storm. And as he was climbing back into that spotless truck, he stopped, one boot on the running board, and he looked out toward the back of the yard, toward that double-locked gate, for a beat too long, and he said, "You even been through the whole property yet? A lot of ground back there." And I said, "I'm getting to it." And he nodded and smiled with the bottom half of his face and said, "Well, don't wait too long. Weather turns out here." And he drove off. I stood in that settling dust, and every instinct 11 years of service ever installed in me was ringing like a bell. He knows something. I couldn't have told you what or how, but I'd have bet the whole yard on it. That man knew something about my inheritance that I didn't, and he'd known it since before I ever got off the bus. That night, I finally opened the drawer. And I mean that literally. Ray's bedroom had a small desk, and the bottom drawer was locked, and none of the keys on Gerald's ring fitted, and out of some strange respect I'd left it alone for 2 months. That night, respect lost the argument. I found the key eventually, taped to the underside of the kitchen table, which should tell you something, because a man doesn't hide a key like that to protect his stamp collection. And inside that drawer, I found 3 things that rearranged my life. The first was money, a coffee can, and inside it, rolled in rubber bands, a little over $9,000 in worn 20s and 50s. Emergency money, hermit money. My knees actually went weak, because that was the back taxes solved in one stroke. The second was letters. A bundle of envelopes, maybe 30 of them, tied with twine, and when I saw the handwriting on the top one, my heart stopped, because I'd have known that careful, cramped script anywhere in the world. My father's. Every envelope addressed to Raymond Whitmore at this address, in my father's hand, and every single one of them unopened. Except the last one, postmarked 8 months before my father died. That one had been opened. Opened, read, and by the look of the creases, read many, many times. The third thing was a notebook, small, black, swollen with age. And on the first page, in Ray's slanted writing, 5 words that dropped the floor out from under me. For Danny, if he comes. For Danny, if he comes. He wrote that 9 years before he died. 9 years before a lawyer's letter found a homeless man in an Ohio day shelter. My uncle, who never met me, sitting in this desert, writing my name in a notebook on the faith that someday, somehow, his brother's boy would be standing in this room, holding it. I sat down on the floor of that bedroom, with the coffee can and the letters and the notebook around me, and I did not sleep that night either. But this time it wasn't the cold keeping me awake. It was the feeling, unmistakable, electric, that I was standing at the top of a staircase, leading down into everything my family had ever refused to say out loud. And the first step was that notebook. I opened it, and the first full page began with a sentence I will remember on my deathbed. "Danny," it said, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you found the drawer, which means you're curious and stubborn, which means you're one of us, There's something in the back of the yard that belongs to you. It has belonged to you since before you were born, even though nobody ever told you. Before you go back there, you need to know the story, the whole story, because the thing that's buried back there buried this family right along with it. So pour a coffee, boy. Let me finally tell you about your father and me, and about the car. I did exactly what he said. I made coffee in a dead man's pot at 2 a.m, and I sat at his kitchen table under the photograph of the two brothers, and I read the whole notebook straight through as the sun came up. And now I'm going to tell you what it said. The way Ray told me, because some stories you don't summarize. Some stories you pass on whole. It starts in 1971, in that same Ohio town, with two brothers who were, in Ray's words, closer than fingers on a hand. Thomas, my father, was 22, steady, careful, already working at the factory. Raymond was 20, and by his own cheerful admission, the wild one, allergic to caution, in love with speed. But the thing they shared, the thing that was practically their religion, was cars. They spent every dollar and every free hour at the local dirt track and the drag strip 2 counties over, and they had a plan, an actual written-down plan, to open a garage together. Whitmore Brothers Automotive. Ray even sketched the sign in the notebook margin 50 years later, from memory. 2 W's linked together like a chain. And then, in the spring of 1972, the car came into their lives. Ray writes that he heard about it through a friend of a friend, the way all legends start. A widow 1 town over was clearing her late husband's property, and in the barn there was a car her husband had bought new, driven for 1 summer, and parked when his health failed. She wanted it gone, didn't care much what for. The brothers drove out on a Sunday, and Ray describes the barn door opening like other men describe religious experiences. Dust in the light beams, he wrote, and under a canvas tarp, sitting on flat tires, was a 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. Curious yellow paint. Black billboard stripes. 4-speed manual, and under the hood, the 426 Hemi. Now some of you watching just fell off your chairs, and the rest of you are wondering what the fuss is. So let me do for you what the notebook did for me. Because I'm my father's son, but even I didn't grasp it at first. In 1971, Plymouth built the Cuda by the thousands, but the convertible with the Hemi engine, the biggest, angriest motor Chrysler made, was a unicorn even when it was new. It was expensive, insurance companies hated it, and almost nobody ordered one. In that final year, out of everything Plymouth produced, the number of Hemi Cuda convertibles built for the whole world was 11. 11 cars. And of those 11, only a handful had the 4-speed manual transmission. We are talking about one of the rarest American production cars that has ever existed. Today, the surviving examples are worth millions, not $1 million. Millions, plural. One of them is famously the first muscle car ever to crack $5 million at auction. But in 1972, it was just a 2-year-old used car with a dead battery in a widow's barn, and she sold it to 2 grinning brothers from Ohio for $800. $800. They emptied both their savings accounts and borrowed the last $140 from their mother. Ray writes about the summer that followed like it was the best season of his life, and reading it, I believe him. They got her running in a weekend. They drove her to the strip and embarrassed cars costing 5 times as much. He writes about my father, my quiet, careful father, laughing so hard at 110 miles an hour that he could barely shift. That detail broke me a little, I'll be honest. I knew that man 35 years, and I never once saw that version of him. The plan crystallized that summer. The Cuda, was the garage. They'd enjoy her a few years, watch her value climb, because even then, sharp eyes could see where those cars were heading. And one day she'd be the down payment on Whitmore Brothers Automotive. Their future, sitting on 4 tires, painted, curious, yellow. And then came the fall of 1973. And the night that split my family like lightning splits a tree. Ray's handwriting changes when he gets to this part. It gets smaller, tighter, like the words themselves hurt. There was a man in town, an older guy with money and a reputation, who ran a private card game and lent cash on the side. Ray, 22 by then, wild as ever, had gotten himself into that game, and then into that man's pocket, deeper than he ever admitted to anyone. And one October night, drunk, desperate, and sure, the way only a 22-year-old can be sure, that his luck was one hand from turning, Ray did the unforgivable. He put the cutest title on the table. Half his brother's, all of their future. And he lost it. He lost the car. I had to put the notebook down when I read that. Because in one paragraph, 50 years of silence suddenly made sense. Some things break, Danny, and they stay broken. My father wasn't talking about a mystery. He was talking about a wound. But here's where the story turns, and this is the part nobody knew. Not my father, not anyone, until I read it at that kitchen table. Ray never handed the car over. The morning after the game, sick with shame, he went to beg the man for time, and what he found instead scared him worse than the debt. The man's paperwork was ready before the game ever started. The title transfer, a bill of sale backdated 2 weeks. Ray writes, "That's when I understood the whole night. I hadn't lost the car in that game. The game existed to take the car. Word was out about what those kudas were, and I'd been marked like a fish. And Danny, the way that man smiled when he told me my brother's signature would be no problem to arrange, that's the moment I knew he'd stolen cars this way before, and that the law in that town belonged to him." So Ray made a choice. A catastrophic, loyal, 22-year-old's choice. That night, he took the Cuda, the real title, and a duffel bag, and he drove west, and he did not stop. He left a note for my father, 4 words. "I'll fix this. Wait," and he vanished. He couldn't tell Thomas where he was, he writes, because the debt was his alone, and the man's reach was long, and any letter with a return address was a map. So the silence began. My father woke up to a missing brother, a missing car, and a dangerous man on the porch demanding property that had crossed a card table. From where my father stood, there was only one story that made sense. His little brother had gambled away their future and then stolen it and run. He paid the man off out of his own pocket over 2 years to keep the trouble from following the family, and he closed the drawer. Ray drifted west with the most valuable secret in America under a car cover, and eventually the road ended in Cottonwood Springs, Arizona, at a busted salvage yard whose old owner would take cash. No questions. And in 1976, on a moonless night, with a rented backhoe and nobody watching, my uncle dug a hole at the back of that yard, sealed the Cuda inside a welded steel shipping container wrapped in tar and heavy plastic, packed in industrial desiccant, drained and prepped with a mechanic's obsessive love. And he buried it. He buried the car, the proof, the shame, and the future, 8 feet down in the desert. And then he built a junkyard on top of his own broken heart and guarded it for the rest of his life. The last pages of the notebook are the hardest, and I'll only give you the shape of them. Ray wrote to his brother for decades. "You saw the envelopes," he says, "and you noticed, I imagine, that they're addressed to me, at my own address. Yes, I wrote them, and never sent them. 40 years of letters into a drawer, because every year that passed made the first sentence harder to write. And then, 8 months before your father died, Danny, a letter came the other direction. Out of nowhere. 1 page. Your dad was sick and knew it, and somehow, through an old friend, he'd found me. And in that letter he wrote, "I know you think I hate you, Ray. I stopped hating you in 1980. I just never learned how to say so. Whatever happened to the car, you were right about one thing. It was never about the car. Come home." Ray's next line is the one I read through tears. "I bought the plane ticket, Danny. It's in this drawer, under the can. Look at the date. I was 11 days too late." The funeral notice reached me before I ever boarded. Ray was right. Tell him Ray was right. My father's last message, and now, finally, 50 years and 2 graves later, I understood it, and I was the only Whitmore left to hear it. The notebook ends with this: "The car is yours, Danny. It was always going to be yours. The last thing the Whitmore brothers ever built together. The map is on the final page. Dig her up, boy, and whatever you do with her, do it out loud, in the daylight, with your name on it." We did enough burying for one family. The map, when I turned to that final page, was pure Ray. No X marks the spot nonsense. It was a mechanic's drawing, precise as a blueprint. From the northeast corner post of the inner fence, 42 feet on a bearing he specified, to a datum point he'd marked in the most Ray way imaginable. The engine block of a 1958 Chevy he'd half buried upright as a monument that looked, to anyone else, like just another piece of junk sinking into the desert. From the block, 18 feet due south. Container lid at roughly 6 feet. Car sits nose west. And then one last line, underlined twice. "Go slow near the lid. She's waited 50 years. She can wait one more careful afternoon." Now, I want to walk you through the next 2 weeks properly, because everybody always asks about the dig. And the truth is, the dig was the easy part. The hard part was doing what Ray asked. Doing it out loud, in the daylight, with my name on it. Because think about my position for a second. I'm a formerly homeless man, in town 5 minutes, about to unearth what might be a multi-million-dollar automobile that vanished from Ohio in 1973 under circumstances involving a crooked card game. Every fear I owned lined up to take a number. What if the title in the drawer wasn't clean? What if that old crook's family had a claim? What if the government, the state, somebody, anybody, decided a man like me couldn't possibly own a thing like that? When you've been at the bottom, you don't trust luck. You interrogate it. So the first call I made wasn't to a backhoe company. It was to Gerald. I drove to his office with the notebook, the letters, the title, all of it, laid it on his desk, and said, "Before I put one shovel in the ground, tell me where I stand." And I watched a 70-year-old lawyer read that notebook cover to cover, take his glasses off, wipe his eyes with a handkerchief, actual handkerchief, and say, "Well, in 40 years of probate, I have never." And then he got to work, because under the bolo tie, Gerald is a killer. Over the next week, he confirmed the title was genuine and had never been legally transferred, that the original 1972 bill of sale from the widow, which Ray had kept, tied the chain of ownership up in a bow, that the gambling debt had never created any legal claim, especially since my father had settled it anyway, receipts for which, incredibly, were in my father's papers that I'd kept in my duffel through 3 years of homelessness, because I couldn't bear to throw out anything with his handwriting. 50 years apart, and the two brothers' paperwork clicked together like they'd planned it. Maybe they had, in whatever way brothers plan things without speaking. Gerald documented the whole chain, and then he leaned back and said the words I needed. "Daniel, the car is yours. Beyond argument. Now go dig up your birthright." The second thing I did, and this mattered to me, was call the two people who'd earned it. Manny closed the parts store, first time in years, and Dolores told the diner the special was canceled. If I was going to have witnesses to the biggest moment of my life, it was going to be the people who fed me and played chess with me back when all I had was a dead man's coffee cup and a story nobody had heard yet. And I did one more thing. I documented everything. Photos, video on a cheap phone, Gerald's letters, timestamps, partly for the provenance, because with cars like this, the story is worth as much as the steel. But partly, honestly, because of Corrigan. That double-locked gate, that too long look, that don't wait too long. I still didn't know what he knew, but I knew I wanted daylight and paperwork between me and that man. The morning of the dig was a Tuesday in early October, almost exactly 50 years, we realized later, since the night Ray drove west. Desert dawn, cold enough to see your breath, sky like the inside of a shell. Manny knew a fellow with a mid-size excavator, a quiet giant named Robles, who was told only, "We need a careful hole," and shrugged like people asked him for careful holes all the time. I walked the bearing from the corner post twice, found Ray's Chevy engine block exactly where the map said, half sunk in the hardpan like a gravestone, which is exactly what it was. Measured 18 feet south. Drove a stake. And stood there a second with my hand on that stake and my heart going like a hammer, and Dolores put her hand on my shoulder, and nobody said anything. Because what was there to say? The first hour was just desert. Sand, caliche, the excavator peeling it back a careful foot at a time. I want to be honest about what that hour did to me. Doubt, man. Doubt like a physical weight. 50 years is a long time. Floods move earth. Old men misremember. Maybe the notebook was a lonely man's fairy tale. Maybe I'd hauled these good people out here to watch me excavate my own gullibility. I had actually started composing the apology in my head when Robles, who had said maybe 9 words all morning, suddenly feathered the controls, stopped, leaned out of the cab, and said the single greatest word I have ever heard in my life. Metal. We finished by hand, all of us, shovels and brushes like archaeologists, because that's what we were. And bit by bit, out of that red desert dirt, a shape emerged that stopped every conversation. The flat, tar-black top of a steel shipping container, its welded seams still tight, sitting exactly where a heartbroken 25-year-old had lowered it into the earth in 1976. Ray's workmanship, holding its breath under Arizona for half a century, waiting for a Whitmore to come back for it. It took the rest of the day to expose the end of the container and the access panel Ray's map promised. A section he designed to be cut and rewelded. Because of course he had. The man thought of everything. By the time we'd cleaned the seam, it was late afternoon, golden hour, the whole yard glowing like it had been dipped in honey. Manny handed me the angle grinder. My shoulder was screaming, and my hands were shaking, and I would not have surrendered that grinder to God himself. Sparks in the golden light. The old weld giving way inch by inch, and then the panel came free, and a breath of air came out of that container from 1976. Cool and dry and smelling of rubber and grease and time itself, and I put my flashlight up to the darkness. And there she was, under a cotton car cover, gone brittle soft with age, on tires Ray had set on wooden cradles so they wouldn't hold the weight. Surrounded by drums of desiccant that had done their job for 50 years. We peeled the cover back from the front fender the way you'd unwrap something sacred, and the beam of my flashlight fell on paint. Yellow paint. Curious yellow, factory paint, dusty but whole, and the chrome edge of the grill, and the shaker scoop standing up out of that long hood, and the little chrome script on the fender that said Cuda, and I heard Dolores whisper, "Oh my Lord," behind me. And Manny said something in Spanish that I'm told was not appropriate for church, and I just knelt there, in the dirt, at the mouth of that container, looking at the most beautiful machine I have ever seen in my life. 50 years in the ground. And she was perfect. Time-stained, sleeping, but perfect. The last thing the Whitmore brothers ever built together, and the flashlight in my hand was shaking because the man holding it was crying again, and I looked up out of that hole at the sky over Ray's yard and I said it out loud. Finally, the message I'd carried for years. He knows, Ray. He said you were right. He knows. We didn't pull her out that night. Ray had waited 50 years to hand me this car, and I wasn't going to yank it into the world by a chain in the dark. We covered the opening, and Manny, Dolores, Robles, and I sat on the tailgate of Manny's truck at the edge of that hole, eating diner sandwiches under the stars, and I read them parts of the notebook out loud. And it felt less like a recovery operation and more like a wake. The good kind. The kind where somebody finally gets remembered right. The extraction took 3 more days, done properly, with a specialist Gerald found, a recovery outfit out of Phoenix that handles barn finds and museum pieces. And I want to slow down and give you those 3 days, because they taught me more about my uncle than the notebook did. Day 1 was all about the container itself, and the Phoenix crew, men who have opened barns and storage units, and one actual mine shaft, kept going quiet and shaking their heads, and finally the foreman, a fellow named Ortiz, pulled me aside and said, "I need you to understand something. People bury cars. It happens more than you'd think. And in 30 years, I have never once seen it done right. They wrap them in plastic, and the plastic sweats and the car dissolves. They forget drainage. They forget the tires. They forget that the ground moves. Whoever did this," he said, tapping the container wall, "did not forget one single thing. He'd found Ray's drainage gravel bed under the container. He'd found the sacrificial zinc blocks Ray had welded to the steel, so the desert would eat those instead of the box, a trick off ocean ships in the middle of a landlocked state in 1976. He'd found vent tubes, capped and filtered, run up through the soil disguised inside a fence post, so the container could breathe without drowning. Your uncle, Ortiz said, wasn't hiding this car, he was preserving it. There's a difference. One is a man burying a body. The other is a man building a vault around a promise. Day 2, we prepared the car herself to move, and this is where I got to put my own hands on her properly for the first time, and I'm not ashamed to say I introduced myself out loud before I touched her, and the Phoenix guys pretended not to hear, because apparently everybody does that. Ray had drained every fluid and fogged the cylinders with preservative oil. He'd stuffed the intake and the exhaust with oiled cloth and sealed them. He'd pulled the battery. He'd coated every inch of brightwork in a film of grease that wiped away 50 years later like it had been applied the previous Tuesday. Under the car, taped to the frame rail in a wax bag, we found the spark plugs, individually wrapped, numbered by cylinder, with a note that said, "She'll want fresh ones anyway, but these were hers." That's the level of man we're discussing. He saved her original spark plugs. For sentiment. And day 3, we brought her up into the world. Steel ramps, a winch working slower than a funeral procession. All of us walking beside her with our hands hovering an inch off the sheet metal, like parents spotting a toddler. When the front tires, the new cradled and bagged spares Ray had left for exactly this purpose, because of course he had, touched actual open ground, Dolores started clapping, all alone at first. And then everybody was. 8 people applauding in an empty desert. And if you'd driven past on that dirt road, you'd have thought we'd lost our minds. And you'd have been half right. I want to tell you about one more moment before the auction part of this story, because people always ask, did you ever hear it run? We did. Weeks later, after the authentication, with 2 specialists supervising and my heart in my throat, we woke the Hemi up. Fresh fluids, the fuel system gone through, new plugs, though the originals sat on the bench in their numbered wrappers like relics, and Ray's preservation had been so complete that the engine turned by hand like it had been parked over a long weekend. And on a cold, clear morning, with Manny filming on his phone and Dolores holding my arm and Preach, who'd come out by then. Standing at parade rest like the occasion demanded it, I sat in the driver's seat where my father had once laughed at 110 miles an hour, and I turned the key. She caught on the 3rd crank. And that sound, my friends. I have heard artillery. I have heard a stadium at full throat. I have never heard anything like 8 cylinders of 1971 coming back from the dead in the desert silence. It wasn't a roar, not at first. It was a huge, ragged breath, like something surfacing, and then it settled into that impossible Hemi idle, that lopey, muscular heartbeat, and every bird in the yard went up at once, and the sound rolled out across 11 acres of dead cars like a rooster crowing over a graveyard, and I put my forehead on the steering wheel and let her run, and I felt the vibration of my family's whole story coming up through my hands. Manny's video of that moment is 40 seconds long. You can hear Dolores laughing and crying at the same time. You can hear Preach say clear as a bell, "Well, hello." And you can see my shoulders shaking, and I will never, ever apologize for that. 50 years of silence, ended by an engine. My father was right all along. An engine doesn't lie to you. That morning, it told the truth loud enough for both brothers to hear it, wherever they were listening from. When we finally rolled her out of the workshop into the open sun, the first daylight to touch that yellow paint since Gerald Ford was president, I swear the whole yard went quiet. Even the quail. Inside the car, Ray had left one more time capsule. On the driver's seat, a toolbox, the twin of my father's, and I did not know until that moment that they'd bought them as a pair. In the glove box, the original window sticker, the build sheet, the 72 bill of sale, and one photograph I'd never seen. The 2 brothers again, but this time with the Cuda. At the drag strip, my father behind the wheel mid-laugh, exactly like the notebook described. And tucked under the sun visor, in Ray's hand, a note with 6 words. Told you I'd fix it, Tommy. I'm not going to walk you through every step of what happened over the following months, because this video would be 4 hours long. But I owe you the highlights, because the highlights are unbelievable. Word travels at the speed of light in the collector car world. Within 2 weeks of Gerald quietly making inquiries about authentication, my phone, the cheap prepaid phone of a man who'd been homeless that same spring, was ringing with numbers from Scottsdale, from Michigan, from Monterey. The authentication process was a story in itself. There are people, and I mean world-level experts, who have devoted their lives specifically to Hemi Cudas, who maintain registries of every one of those 11 convertibles, and here's the thing that made my car a supernova in that little world. The registry had my car listed with 3 chilling words. Whereabouts unknown, presumed lost. For 50 years, the 11th car had been a ghost story collectors told each other. Chassis experts flew in. They checked the numbers on the body, the engine, the transmission, the fender tag, the build sheet. Everything matched everything. Numbers matching. One repaint of factory-correct paint never even needed. Original drivetrain, 29,000 miles, documented from the widow's barn to the card game to the container. The lead authenticator, a gray-haired man who had personally inspected most of the surviving cars on Earth, stood up from under my CUDA in the workshop, took a long breath, and said, "Son, I need to sit down." In 50 years of doing this is the most significant American muscle car discovery I have ever put my hands on. The valuation conversations were surreal to the point of comedy. I'd be standing in the yard in my work boots, pulling a water pump off a Datsun for a customer, and a voice on the phone from an auction house would be saying words like conservatively $4.5 million and realistically, Mr. Whitmore. With this provenance, with this story, the ceiling is difficult to predict. I'd hang up and go back to the water pump and charge the man his $35, because honestly, the water pump made more sense to me. And then there was Corrigan. I promised you that thread, and here's where it pays off, and I want you to know I've calmed down about it. Mostly. Once the story broke locally, before it went national, Vance Corrigan came down my dirt road one more time, and this visit was not friendly. Turns out, and Gerald's investigator later confirmed every bit of this, Corrigan's late father had bought scrap roots in this county for decades, and among his papers was a story the old man used to tell about a hermit at a salvage yard who, one drunken Christmas Eve in the 80s, the only slip Ray ever made in 50 years, had said something about sitting on a gold mine, about a car in the ground worth more than the whole county. Everybody had laughed it off as junkyard talk. Everybody except, eventually, the son with the pressed shirts, who did enough digging in registries and old Ohio records to realize which car was rumored missing, and who then spent the months after Ray's death trying to buy 11 acres of nothing for pennies before the heir, wherever he is, ever surfaced. $60,000 for a property with a ghost car under it. The man had tried to buy my family's whole story for less than the sales tax on that CUDA. He stood in my yard making noises about verbal agreements with my uncle and finder's considerations and how complicated things could get for someone like me. And I let him finish. And then I did something the Danny of 3 years earlier could never have done. I didn't shout. I didn't shrink. I just said, "Mr. Corrigan, my lawyer's name is Gerald Hendricks. My paperwork goes back to 1972, and my gate closes at 6. And I walked him to it, and I closed it, and I have not seen that spotless truck since." Which left the last question, the one everybody asks me, the one you're probably shouting at your screen right now. "Danny, did you sell the car?" I want to tell you honestly that I went back and forth for months. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about miracles. They come with weight. That car was the last thing my father and my uncle built together. Their laughter was in it. Their ruin was in it. Their apology was in it. Some nights I'd sit in the workshop next to her with a cup of coffee, just the two of us, and think, how do you put a price on a resurrected family? And other nights I'd think about Preach under that overpass, about Marcus and Jenny, about the 3 winters, about how many men and women were sleeping on concrete that exact minute while I sat next to 7 figures of yellow steel, and the answer would look a little different. In the end, it was Ray who decided it. Do it out loud, in the daylight, with your name on it. We did enough burying for one family. The auction was in Scottsdale in January, 16 months after I stepped off that Greyhound. They gave her a featured evening slot. The whole story told on the big screens, the barn, the brothers, the card game, the container, the notebook. They flew me out and put me in a suit. The first suit I have ever owned, and Dolores fixed my tie in the hotel lobby because my hands weren't working, and Manny stood on my other side the whole night like a cornerman. When she rolled onto that auction stage under the lights, that impossible yellow blazing, 4,000 people stood up. Stood up for my family's car. The bidding opened at $2 million, and my ears started ringing, and they did not stop. 2.5. 3. 3.5. And the auctioneer's voice climbing like a preacher's. At $4 million, it was down to 2 phone bidders and a man in the third row, and at 4.6, the room was so quiet you could hear the auctioneer breathe, and the hammer came down at $4,850,000. And the room came apart, and Manny was pounding my shoulders. The bad one, too. And I didn't feel a thing. And somewhere in all that noise I closed my eyes, and I saw 2 young men leaning on a fender in 1972, grinning like the world hadn't gotten to them yet. You were right, Ray. It was never about the car. But my God, the car didn't hurt. Now, before anyone worries, the buyer was exactly who you'd hope. A collector, a serious one, with a private museum where the 11th car now sits fully documented, story and all. And he's kept every promise he made me. The notebook story travels with the car forever. There's a plaque with both brothers' names, and once a year, it's in the contract. Gerald saw to that. I get to visit her, and the first time I did, I brought my father's toolbox and just set it on the floor beside her for an hour. The museum staff thought I was eccentric. That's fine. They're not wrong. So what does a man who was homeless 2 years earlier do with roughly $4 million after taxes and fees? I'll tell you what I did, and I'll tell you why, and then I'll let you go. I promise. Though if you've made it this far, do me that favor from the beginning if you haven't yet. Tap the like, tap subscribe, and seriously, that comment section, tell me where in the world you are, because this next part is the part I most want the whole world to hear. The first thing I did was fix the roof on Ray's little house. Not replace the house. Fix the roof. I live there still, and I will live there until they carry me out, because that house is the first place in my adult life that ever felt like it wanted me in it. The second thing I did was find every person who'd carried me when I had nothing. Carol, from the outreach program that bought my bus ticket, her program got a donation that made her sit down on the floor of her office, and it gets one every year. Gerald tried to refuse anything beyond his fee, so I paid off the mortgage on his office building behind his back, and the bolo tie was very stern with me about it, and then he cried, so we're even for the handkerchief. Dolores owns her diner now instead of renting it. Manny and I are still 400 and something chess games deep, and he still wins most of them. Money changes nothing. And then I went back to Ohio. I stood at my father's grave for the first time since the funeral, and I told him everything, out loud, start to finish, the whole story you just heard. And let me tell you, a man talking to a headstone for 2 hours draws some looks in Ohio, and I could not have cared less. And then I drove to the Route 9 overpass. Marcus wasn't there anymore. He'd gotten housing. I found him later, and we handled his back surgery. Jenny was there. Preach was there. Older. Thinner. Same eyes. I sat down on the concrete next to him like I'd never left. And he looked at me. And looked at my boots, which were new, and said, "Well, somebody remembered himself." And I said, somebody had help. And then I told him what I'd built, and asked him to come see it. Because here's the third thing, the main thing, the thing that all of this was actually for. The back 2 acres of Ray's yard, the ground that hid that car for 50 years, doesn't hide anything anymore. Today there are buildings on it. It's called the back lot. That's the legal name. Ray would have liked the joke. And it is a transitional housing and job training program for homeless veterans. 12 small homes so far, real homes with doors that lock. And the big workshop runs a certification program where vets learn automotive repair, taught partly by me, on cars donated from all over the country, some of them pulled right out of Ray's rows and brought back to life by hands that are relearning, like mine did, that they still know things. We've had 31 men and women come through so far. 22 are employed and housed today. One of them is Marcus. One of them, and this is my favorite sentence I've ever said out loud, is the program's resident elder and unofficial chaplain, a Vietnam-era vet everybody calls Preach, who sits on a porch facing west in the evenings, in a chair that's slowly wearing down to the shape of a man, keeping an eye on the yard. "Keep one thing that reminds you who you are," he told me once. Turns out for me, it was a toolbox. For the yard, it turned out to be people. The junkyard itself still runs. Believe it or not, I still pull parts. Wednesday mornings mostly, boots in the dirt, index cards, $35 water pumps. Because a man needs work his hands understand, and because every part I pull is a conversation with two brothers I'm still getting to know. The unopened letters, my father's 40 years of unsent words to Ray. I read one each year, on November the 9th, on the porch, out loud, so somebody finally hears them. I've read 3 so far. I figure I've got a few decades of listening left to do, and I intend to be here for all of it. So that's it. That's the story of the specific car buried in the back, and how it changed everything. But before you go, let me tell you what I think the story is actually about, because it took me a long time to see it, and if this video does one thing, I wanted to hand you this. It was never about the car. Ray said it. My father said it. And it took both their lives and half of mine to learn it. A 426 Hemi is a miracle of engineering, but it can't hold a grudge, and it can't forgive one either. What was buried in the back of that yard for 50 years wasn't really an automobile. It was an apology that 2 proud men never figured out how to say while they were breathing. Every night Ray walked that path to the fence. He wasn't checking on an investment. He was visiting the conversation he never had. And the treasure I actually inherited wasn't yellow, and it didn't have a shaker scoop. It was the truth. The truth about my family, the proof that the people who raise us in silence are usually protecting a wound, not hiding a crime, and the chance, the outrageous, undeserved chance, to be the one Whitmore who finally does things out loud, in the daylight. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry, looking back. Angry at the man who rigged that card game. Angry at the system that let a decorated mechanic sleep under an overpass for 3 winters. Angry at the 50 years my family lost to pride. And the honest answer is that I was, for a while. And then I stood one evening at that reopened patch of ground in the back of the yard, where the hole used to be, where 12 front porches now catch the sunset, and I understood something. Anger is just another thing you bury, and everything you bury, you end up guarding every night for the rest of your life, walking a path into the dirt. I've watched what that costs a man. I'd rather plant things. So here's what I want to leave you with, wherever you are in the world right now. If you've got a brother, a sister, a father, a friend, somebody sitting behind 50 years of silence, or 5 years, or 5 weeks, don't wait for a lawyer's letter. Don't leave it for a notebook in a locked drawer. Ray bought his plane ticket 11 days too late, and I promise you, that regret weighed more than the car ever did. Make the call. Write the letter and actually send it. Some things break and it's nobody's fault, my father told me, and they stay broken. He was wrong about the last part. It just took 2 funerals and a buried CUDA to prove it. And if you're watching this from a shelter, or a car, or a couch that isn't yours, or an overpass, I see you. I was you. Keep your toolbox clean, whatever your toolbox is. Keep the one thing that reminds you who you are, and hold on. because your letter might already be in the mail, and even if it isn't, you are worth more than the world's eyes are telling you right now. Take it from a man the world forgot for 3 years. The story is not over until you say it is. If this story moved you, you know what to do. Hit that like button so it reaches somebody who needs it tonight. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens next out here at the yard. Because between the program, the letters, and about 350 cars I still haven't opened the trunks of, believe me, there's more coming. And down in those comments, tell me where you're watching from. And if you're feeling brave, tell me the name of the person you're going to call after this video. I read every comment on this channel, usually on the porch, in Ray's chair, facing west. Thanks for sitting around the fire with me tonight. This is Danny Whitmore, from 11 acres of second chances at the end of a dirt road in Cottonwood Springs, Arizona. Take care of each other out there. And go make that call.